So Mark, why don't you tell us what happens in a recap to issue 50?
We open in the Oscorp sub-basement and the living brain is going cuckoo caca. Dr. Connors and Doug want to know where the feedback is coming from, and they're confused because it seems to be coming from the brain. However, the feedback is coming in at the same frequency as the Oscorp computer, and Connors presumes it's the living brain sending a message. Quickly he shouts, "Get Peter Parker!" Parker is out in Chelsea with a realtor. Renting in Chelsea? In this economy? Spidey webs the realtor for taking misleading photos of the unit when Norman Osborn calls and wants to know why he's not in the office. Spider-Man mentions it's summer Fridays, which means he can do Spider-Man stuff on his days off. However, Osborn lets him know that Dr. Connors is in a tizzy about the living brain sending a message to Peter Parker. Spidey is concerned that the living brain is sending any kind of messages since Osborn promised that no one else who could find out Peter's identity would access it. And Norman is concerned that Peter is looking into rent in Chelsea. In this economy? I mean, literally, the joke I just made. Anyway, Spidey is off to Oscorp, and we get lots of science gobbledygook that I'm sure Dan is going to convince me is important to recap.
I'm not. Honestly, you go far more hardcore on these recaps than I would.
It turns out that there is an analog signal coming from the living brain because it cannibalized part of its superstructure to form a crude transducer. Yes, just what I was thinking. Connors wants to know what Peter's role was in procuring the living brain, and Peter explains it's actually something between Spider-Man and Norman. When Connors says the brain sent a signal as to who is Spider-Man, we all discover the brain believes Peter Parker is not Spider-Man. The scientists want to know what that could possibly mean before another message comes out. What could it read? So Peter goes to Norman's office, and Osborn is just dealing with some acquisition papers. M&A in this economy? Norman is talking super vaguely about opening up old lines of work and possibly transferring the ownership of Oscorp to someone new. Peter, of course, asks if something not so great is in the works, and Norman parries that inquisition aside. Peter then reads the other message from the living brain, hoping that Norman can provide some insight. It reads, "Charlie Starlight," and Norman looks quite furrowed by that since those are his code words. Norman jokes that the living brain knows his secret. It's that he's the Gold Goblin, haha. But the real concern is, how did it figure out Norman's passwords? Norman suggests that there was a breach of the servers, and then Peter reveals that there's actually a third word in the message, and before Norman can stop him, Peter says the last word, and Osborn goes full Green Goblin mode, and the turn is complete. Osborn office fills with green gas to take away Peter's spider powers, and the fight is on. Peter survives a non-fatal goblin glider to the gut and a pumpkin bomb, and Norman is orating like his inner supervillain before getting into his goblin gear. The goblin's laughter fills the room, but Peter tells us that it doesn't scare him anymore, it just makes him angry. So Peter throws a punch that lacks spider strength, and Norman jokes that it was a terrible waste of his time, since Peter only has the proportionate strength of a whiny little milksop. Peter replies that Norman promised this wouldn't happen, but Norman runs through the fact that the goblin is deep within him and was in Peter too. Remember a few issues ago when Peter nearly killed Kraven? And then we get the confirmation that some of Peter's actions he remembers, others, like making a date with Michelle, he does not. Peter doesn't understand how Norman turned from the goblin back into Norman during the whole ordeal, so Goblin removes his mask and turns back into sniveling Norman. We flash back over to Connors, Doug, and the brain is still going crazy. Doug thinks the brain is killing itself, but Connors says it's a birth. Very, very dramatic. But back to Norman and Peter is confronting Norman about what the goblin knows. He wants to know if he let the goblin into Peter's lab. Norman counters with a devious look and a headbutt, and he's back into goblin mode, and the fight continues. Meanwhile, the brain is on fire! After extinguishing it, Connors watches as the brain transforms into the Walking Brain. The Walking Brain reiterates that Peter Parker is not Spider-Man. We are quickly whisked back to Goblin and Spider-Man as the Goblin drags Spidey by his head to Peter's lab. Goblin is looking for secrets and checks the bug from the Oscorp suit. The bug opens up and shoots Goblin with a gas that neutralizes his powers. Peter tricked Norman into bringing him back there to do that because despite the past 2 years of friendship, Peter deep down saw this coming and had his failsafe lined up. Then Peter drops the ultimate gut punch when he tells Norman he only took the job at Oscorp because he never trusted him. So now Norman hits Spider-Man with one final gut punch of his own. While he was under the Goblin Sin's influence, he used the Winkler device, on him, as the Queen Goblin said a few issues ago. Meanwhile, the Brain is going crazy and says that Peter Parker is not Spider-Man is a warning. So Goblin says his own trigger phrase. Dan, I'm afraid to say it here because I just don't know what will happen to you.
Oh no.
Regardless, it's something about Jekyll and Hyde, and just like that, Peter is transformed into a maniacally laughing goblin-like character. Flash over to Kreiju, and he digs up where the spear of Norman Sins was buried, and indeed, they have been stolen from their grave, off to do terrible things. Then we get some filler stories. I'm not going to recap all of them, Dan, I'm sorry. But then the epilogue, I tell you, it's the Brain, and he's hijacking all of Oscorp's servers despite Connors and Doug trying to stop him. He turns on the security cameras, and the two scientists see what Goblin is doing to Spider-Man. The Brain is off to the access tunnel to save Spider-Man, and Connors and a reluctant Doug are there to help.